ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, our leader, Hugh Taft Morales, learning from Frederick Douglass. Please welcome Hugh.
Thank you. Before I start, I want to first thank people for facilitating my visit today, my slightly viral infected visit, so I'm staying my distance from everybody and leaving immediately after. I told my wife when I began to feel ill earlier this week that I had never missed, due to illness, any platform occasion that I was scheduled to speak at over my 9 years of being an ethical culture leader, and I was not going to miss this one. So I appreciate very much that Nicole gave me a call today, this week. It was not until, I think it was Wednesday, that you called me and told me that Kevin Douglas Green was in Philadelphia for an event that she had organized. So I want to ask him, after giving a few things about his life, first of all, happy birthday. He was born the same month as his great-great-grandfather, Frederick Douglass. Kevin Douglas Green had dedicated his life to serving his country after 20 years of active duty in the U.S. Army and 12 years as a human resource specialist at a VA hospital. He's, over that time, spent a lot of time promoting self-worth, pride, and education of youth in this country by sharing the legacy of his great-great-grandfather and working to abolish modern-day slavery. So if you would please do us the honor of sharing some words with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I appreciate your words. Appreciate your words. I'm honored, more than honored, to be here today. As a lot of people think, it's just an honor to wake up in the morning, because God is good, and we always have to recognize that. At least I do. Again, I'd like to thank Ms. Ross over here for her diligent work within the community of Philadelphia and helping me to meet all the fine citizens of the state of Pennsylvania and here in Philadelphia. So it's a great honor. There are some places I go and I talk, it's real easy, and this one's sometimes it's kind of gotta warm up to not you guys. It's just the overall energy that's in here, or the reason that everyone's in here. I mean, this is an ethical society, so everybody's in here for a reason, and the reason is not to listen to me. It's because you have a passion for the way that society is and the way society should be ran, and how everyone should be able to treat each other with dignity and compassion over all types of walks of life and circumstances. Now, as one thing I like to do is just quickly do my lineage of my life of Frederick Douglass. Of course, Frederick Douglass is my great-great-grandfather. Charles Douglass is my great-grandfather. Allie Douglass is my grandfather, and Jean Douglas Green was my mother. So the line, when I could just say the names like that, it doesn't really seem that far away, and everything, bloodline is just straight down there. There's no bends and turns trying to figure out how I'm related to Frederick Douglass. It's pretty much, as exciting as it is, it's still just that simple, straight down the line, just like that. Now, I just, going to just take a few moments, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. This being Black History Month, my grandfather, Hallie Douglas, actually is an alumnus of Harvard University, and so was the the father of Black History Week and Black History Month, and I shouldn't forget the name, but it's... Say it again? I still can't hear you, but... No. And I said it all day yesterday, and I'm getting... Carter G. Woodson, thank you very much. Carter G. Woodson, and just have to apologize for forgetting your name because he's such an icon in Black history also. But my grandfather, both of them were alumnus of Harvard University, and they also worked together at Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. So, Black History Month, as a lot of people recognize, it's, Black history is part of American history. The idea, should we still celebrate Black History Month, or should we, just expand across the whole time of the year to celebrate and recognize not only Black history, but all the other accomplishments and races and everything across the tapestry of the United States that should be celebrated all year. I do feel that Black History Month is very, very important, regardless of how many days it is in the month. But also, I strongly believe that it's not just delegated to or pigeonholed to February. Places like this, Society for ethical societies and other places that have platforms for social justice. Frederick Douglass was a part of, Ida B. Wells, Martin Luther King. So every day in this country, there's always someone or some group that is doing an outline of how this country and this world can be a better place. And the only way we can really do that is by realizing where we come from and our ancestors that paved the way for us to get to the place that we are now. Paving the way to get to where we are now. The road, it depends on which road you want to look at, because some of the roads are dirt roads, some of the roads are paved roads. There's good roads and bad roads of how we got to where we are today, and we have to recognize that to be able to, to combine these two roads into something that everyone is able to go along the same road at the same time and a smooth journey through life. So that's just a little bit about what I was thinking about today. The Douglass family, even though we're not really very large today, but we do have a strong voice. The Frederick Douglass Family Initiative, which is actually ran by Kenneth Morris, who's my cousin. He's a great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And then his mother, my cousin Nettie Douglass, is the vice president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative. And as for myself, I am a strong family supporter. I'm not on the board or anything like that, but as a Douglass, I still go out and I do events like this, but I fully support the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative by, speaking about it. We were at an event this week in Washington, D.C., Frederick Douglass 200, so we were closing out that bicentennial of Frederick Douglass's birth at a gala where several 200 certificates, people were recognized based on what they do in this country, in this world, in education, philanthropy, all these different broad spectrums. So, and I just want to make sure that the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative was recognized and realized that, I am Kevin Douglas Green, and Kenneth is Kenneth Morris, and we both are out here speaking. He does a whole lot more than I do, because I have a 9 to 5 job every week with the Department of Veterans Affairs. But the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative is his lifeblood right now. He dedicates all his time to that, and I fully support him. Now, before I step away, that this is the reprinting of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, and this is being distributed to young people all over the country to try to get at least a million copies of these out. And so we were able to bring some here to Philadelphia this weekend for some of the youth. But also I have some special copies that I have the ability to give out. So I've autographed this for you. Well, I mean, you is you over here. And so I'm going to leave this over here. I can actually, I'll come this way. So I figured that I've really, since it wasn't the plan that I get something and get something. I was told recently I was getting something, and I'm very humbly thank you, not only for this time, not only for the opportunity to hear you speak and to be here and for the gift, but I thank you guys for your, just being great Americans. So I appreciate it, and I look forward to your works. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be sending in an order for a shipment of these to distribute in Philadelphia, so thank you very much. All right, so yeah, this better be good, right? I learned a lot from this book, which is The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. This is the third autobiography of this remarkable individual who was born into slavery. He escaped from slavery. He was a leading abolitionist. He was an advisor to President Lincoln. And he was as much a conscience of our nation during the 19th century as any other single human being. He represented the country that had enslaved him in many ways, including being the minister to Haiti and the Marshal of the District of Columbia. So today, as the issue of race continues to cut deeply into our social life, we need the wisdom of your great-great-grandfather as much as ever before. It's unfortunate that we need it more now probably than we have in a long time, but we do. The introduction of this book was written around 1881 by George Ruffin, who was the first African-American to graduate from Harvard Law School. He was the first black judge in America. And Ruffin describes Douglass, who he probably knew, as sui generis, or in other words, one of a kind, unique. The story behind Frederick Douglass is certainly unique, and I dedicate this talk to him and to his family. But I do think that Douglass might have warned against us putting him on too high a pedestal, that he would be out of reach. I do not think that the legend of Frederick Douglass, that he would want that to obscure his life of flesh and blood. He might have asked me, in fact, to dedicate this talk not to him, but to the millions of people who were born into slavery who never got out of slavery. Or he might have asked me to dedicate this talk today to those who are currently wrestling with the monster that we know as white supremacy. But more than anything, I think he would want this talk to make a real difference. I don't know if I'm up to the task of having that happen. We can learn a lot of lessons from Frederick Douglass. Today, I'm only going to focus on 4. The first is how easy it is to dehumanize somebody who does not have power. The second is how education can both liberate and deeply frustrate. The third is the importance of demanding rights, not just for some, but for all. And the fourth is the depth of Douglass's compassionate forgiveness. So the 4 lessons will be on power, education, rights, and forgiveness. Perhaps the most important of all the lessons is the pragmatic one about power. A man without force is without the essential dignity of humanity. Those were Frederick Douglass's words. When Douglass was given, like some piece of property, to a breaker by the name of Covey, he felt powerless. He said it was like being an oxen who was regularly whipped to extinguish willful independence. But despite being physically strong, Douglass was, quote, completely wrecked, changed, and bewildered, goaded to madness at one time and another, reconciling myself to my wretched condition. He admitted, quote, Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered in my eye dried out. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute. And reinforcing these physical punishments were psychological assaults, constant. The slave system induced within many enslaved people self-loathing and submission. The constant berating was punctuated by rare holidays when the slave masters would encourage slaves to drink heavily and engage in, quote, degrading sports. There was no time for lofty thoughts or dignified reflection. Douglass explained, to enslave men successfully and safely, it is necessary to keep their minds occupied with thoughts and aspirations short of liberty of which they are deprived. Douglass held tight to the aspirations of liberty through most of his years of slavery, but racism greeted him even when he went into the North. He was denied employment, he was beaten up, he was insulted. After the South seceded, in fact, Lincoln, who Douglass greatly admired, and he admired Douglass as well, but Lincoln told him, quote, that blacks were the cause of the war. During the war, Douglass witnessed white mobs rampaging and killing free blacks for competing for employment and dividing the nation. Death threats and indignities did not stop him, however, because he had learned a valuable lesson years earlier. While enslaved, Douglass learned that accepting punishment did not lessen the frequency or intensity of that punishment. Quote, he was whipped oftener who was whipped easiest. Besides, he said, he had reached a point at which I was not afraid to die. That's an unenviable position, but ironically, a powerful one. Much like his friend John Brown, who also drew his power from the fact that he was not afraid to die. John Brown made his way to the gallows in a dignified manner, convicted as a terrorist for his attack on the Harper's Ferry arsenal. John Brown, though, was also not afraid to kill. For him, slavery was evil incarnate, a systemized violence that he would eliminate by any means necessary. While I do not advocate violence, I, as did Douglass, hold grim respect for John Brown. Douglass wrote of Brown's militancy, the horrors wrought by his iron hand cannot be contemplated without a shudder, but it is the shudder which one feels at the execution of a murderer. I'll let you work that one out. In the conclusion of the autobiography, Douglass poetically explains his willingness to fight force with force. Greatness does not come to any people on flowery beds of ease. We must fight to win the prize. No people to whom liberty is given can hold it firmly, wear it as grandly as those who wrench it from the iron hand of the tyrant. The hardships and dangers involved struggle give strength and toughness to the character and enable it to stand firm in storm as well as in sunshine. The more I learn about Douglass and about others who opposed white supremacy, the more I respect them and the more I understand their militancy. without advocating violence. I will talk more about the importance of power in my conclusion. The second lesson that I take from Douglass is how education can both liberate and frustrate. Douglass observed keenly how his oppressors worked to keep slaves from learning how to read or how to think deeply. He was determined then to read and think deeply. He explained the slave master's technique this way. He said, "To make a contented slave, you must make him a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and as far as possible to annihilate his power of reason." So Douglass brightened his vision and strengthened his power of reason. He became a student of the culture of oppression. Douglass paid attention to Hugh, the man who owned him in Baltimore. And he saw how Auld ranted about how education infects young slaves with lofty ideas and ruins them for work in the fields. Douglass writes, "Very well, thought I. Knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. I instinctively assented to the proposition, and from that moment I understood the direct pathway from slavery to freedom." So Mr. Auld had underrated Douglass's comprehension. He was unaware of the impressive lesson that he gave to Douglass. Upon hearing many slave masters also curse abolitionists, Douglass was determined to connect with abolitionists. "An enemy of my enemy must be a friend." He never stopped studying. After Hugh Auld forbade his wife, Mrs. Sophia, from teaching Douglass to read, Douglass intensified his effort to read. He even went down to the dockyards and would watch the carpenters write on the pieces of wood where they would go in the puzzle, and that's how he helped himself learn how to read. He acquired whatever books or scraps of paper to read. He got a book called The Columbia Orator, which offered him both oratorical lessons and liberal political perspectives of explosive nature. Douglass became aware of civilization's riches that were denied to him, and it opened up alternative worlds which contrasted starkly against the ugliness of his current existence. He read about the rights of man, and he was, quote, "no longer the light-hearted Gleason boy." The revelation haunted me, stung me, and made me gloomy and miserable. He was caught in this unsatisfied yearning and rising expectations. "Knowledge only increased my own misery," he said. Small tastes of freedom, you see, made him hungrier for more. When Auld actually allowed him to rent himself out in Baltimore to get wages and then return the wages to his master, he allowed Frederick Douglass to keep a fraction of his wages, thinking that might give him a little bit more gratitude for his master. But Douglass wrote that, quote, "it had the opposite effect. It actually awakened in him the realization that he should get all of the wages that his body earned." So the lesson that I draw from Douglass's education is that learning about systemic oppression is on the one hand a path to liberation, but on the other hand is deeply frustrating. So if you are like me, when you begin studying about the omnipresent ugliness of racism, it will not be an easy path. So be patient from your privileged or unprivileged position. Be patient with the dark clouds that form in your mind, because the frustrations that you meet are part of the work that you have in helping bend the arc of history towards justice. A third lesson that I've drawn from the life and times is that our essential equality should steer us towards demanding equal rights, not just for some, but for all. At the start and end of life, we appreciate our essential equality. Early in life, under the protective love of his grandmother, Douglass was unaware of the distinctions of hierarchy and oppression. He said, "It was some time before I knew myself to be a slave." What incredible love his grandmother must have had. But the inequality forced upon him became clear soon. And once he escaped from oppression's yoke, Douglass spoke out about inequality as an affront to the idealistic egalitarianism of the Constitution. Unlike the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who actually condemned the Constitution, who actually burnt the Constitution because it sanctified slavery, Douglass believed that the Constitution was a tool to extend rights to everyone, not only those freed from slavery, but to Native Americans, to women, to all the poor. He used the law and American values to criticize the forced removal of Native Americans and to promote women's rights. Perhaps Douglass's commitment to feminism grew out of the importance of women in his life. He knew the love and protection of his grandmother the best, and although he was separated from his mother most of his short time that he knew her, he wrote warmly of her loving and protective presence. He said sitting on her knee was like sitting on a throne. He began learning to read under the guidance of Mrs. Sophia, the owner's wife of Baltimore. As an adult, Douglass was particularly grateful to Harriet Beecher Stowe for the, quote, value of the services which you have already rendered my afflicted and persecuted people by the publication of your inimitable book on the subject of slavery. Few books affected Douglass or this country more than Uncle Tom's Cabin, as it publicized the horrors of slavery to the North. Stowe's contribution to the abolitionist cause, along with the contribution of many women, led Douglass to attend the Women's Rights Seneca Falls Convention as the only black who attended. He wrote, "When the true history of anti-slavery cause shall be written, women shall occupy a large space in its pages. For the cause of the slave has been particularly women's cause. Her heart and her conscience have supplied in large degree its motive and its mainspring. Her skill, industry, patience, and perseverance have been wonderfully manifest in every trial hour." So Douglass advocated for women's rights, supported suffragettes like Sarah and Angela Grimke, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony. And while he disagreed with Stanton over whether to secure the vote for free blacks without also demanding women's suffrage, he was still considered a women's rights man. But his egalitarianism also was evident in his embrace of the poor, regardless of their race. Early on, he saw how poor people, and poor whites in particular, were crushed by the plantation system that pushed them onto infertile land and into poverty. Douglass explained, and this is intriguing, he said, the difference between the white slave and the black slave was this: the latter belonged to one slaveholder, the former belonged to slaveholders collectively. Progressive forces today would be well served to recognize that there are common enemies to all poor people, whatever their gender, whatever their race. Douglass said, quote, "We were all plundered by the same plunderers." Douglass understood how often the powerful manipulate the poor, increasing antagonisms along race lines. He believed that the Irish were, quote, "instantly taught when they step upon our soil to hate and despise the Negro." As conservative forces encouraged this narrative of two groups competing for limited jobs, enmity between blacks and Irish grew. After the Civil War, President Andrew Johnson used racism to further set these groups apart. As Douglass wrote, they divided both to conquer each. So the lesson I draw is that this tactic is well alive today. More than ever, we must work on a united front so that we are no longer divided and conquered. A final lesson that I draw was from Douglass's ability to forgive. Now, forgiveness is seductive and it's tricky. For example, I do not think that anyone can forgive any other person or group for harm done to others. Let me be clear. I think only people who are directly harmed can truly forgive those who have harmed them. Those millions harmed by racism in this country who are now dead and gone can forgive no one. So while many whites today, myself included, would like to accept absolution from the generous spirit of Frederick Douglass, we cannot. We can only work to heal, restore, and rebuild our nation so that it reflects the better angels of our nature. But it is remarkable how Douglass was able to so deeply empathize and forgive his oppressors. The once kind Mrs. Sophia, chastised by her husband for being too compassionate to the young Douglass, turned cold and hostile towards him. But Douglass remained grateful for her introducing him to reading, and he sympathized with who he referred to as the poor lady, who he regarded as a victim of the same system that victimized him. He did not blame her, explaining that, quote, nature had made us friends, but slavery had made us enemies. Douglass even sympathized with the pampered white slave owners suffering from the excesses of their bloated lifestyles. Listen to this incredible piece of writing where he sees plantation whites, in this case the Lloyd family, as victims, offering an early analysis of what we now talk about as white fragility. Lurking beneath the rich and tempting viands were invisible spirits of evil, which filled the self-deluded gourmandizer with aches and pains, passions uncontrollable, fierce tempers, dyspepsia, rheumatism, lumbago, and gout, and of these the Lloyds had a full share. And elsewhere in this book, he talks about many instances where he saw other wounded and tormented whites. But certainly the most remarkable display of forgiveness was in the chapter entitled, Time Makes All Things Even. Visiting his old owner, Hugh on his deathbed, Douglass forgave him. He writes, I had made his name and his deeds familiar to the world by my writings in 4 different languages. Yet here we were, after 4 decades, once more face to face. He on his bed, aged and tremulous, drawing near the sunset of his life. And I, his former slave, United States Marshal of the District of Columbia, holding his hand in friendly conversation with him, in a sort of settlement of past differences, preparatory to his stepping into his grave, where all distinctions are at an end, and where the great and the small, the slave and the master are reduced to the same level. He continues, he was no longer to me a slaveholder either in fact or in spirit, and I regarded him as I did myself, a victim of the circumstance of birth, education, law, and custom. This was not a one-time occurrence for Douglass. He consistently demonstrated a sympathy that I do not think I could muster had I been that oppressed. Upon arriving at the White House, for example, for the second inaugural reception, he was blocked at the door by security members who didn't know who he was, rudely, and then almost tricked into leaving by another exit. And when he was finally, at this point, he was world famous. He was rescued by somebody who realized who he was. He forgave the security personnel who said, quote, they were simply complying with an old custom, the outgrowth of slavery, as dogs will sometimes rub their necks long after their collars are removed, thinking they are still there. Douglass forgave all, believing that systems of oppression hurt everyone, the oppressed and the oppressor. So the lesson that I take from Douglass is not that we should demand forgiveness should we feel that we have inherited privilege from this horrible history. For though so many people who have suffered deeply can offer it no more. So the lesson that I think we have to take is not to search for forgiveness, but to fundamentally change the system so forgiveness in the future will be less necessary. As I move towards my conclusion, I'm sorely tempted to offer more forgiveness, I wish I could offer words that soothe and heal. I'd like to empathize some overarching unity of purpose towards which we can all aspire together. And maybe I do in some ways, but while I do draw great inspiration from Frederick Douglass, I have to add this note of caution. Because in the last years of his life, Frederick Douglass did see setbacks to the cause of racial justice. But the overall progress during his lifetime was incredible, and it gave him reason to be optimistic. He was still in the afterglow of the Northern victory of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And even Judge Ruffin, who wrote the introduction, goes so far as to write the following words, that the universal admiration of Douglass has led us to, quote, reasonably expect to hear no more about the inequality of the races, given how racial equality is, in so many words, a settled fact. He believed the very existence of Frederick Douglass in his dignity, wisdom, and stature proved that we were post-racial. That was still believable in the mind of Frederick Douglass at the time. We know that's not true. I cannot even pretend to be as courageous as Douglass would be, but maybe the reason I cannot is that I am too afraid to die. Because I remember as being a kid hearing Martin Luther King declare, if you haven't found something worth dying for, you're not fit to live. And I wondered, what was I willing to die for? Frederick Douglass had little choice, because the profound cause of self-preservation was forced on him. Like many other enslaved souls, his strength grew out of adversity. He wrote, the hardships and dangers involved the struggle give strength and toughness to character and enable it to stand firm in storm as well as in sunshine. So much of his life was lived in the storm of racism, and yet privilege of so many forms has allowed me to enjoy many blessed hours of sunshine. I have not been forced continually into the shadows. But in the darkest time of his life, under the capricious lash of the slave breaker Covey, Douglass was pushed down as far as he could be pushed. He explained, I had reached the point at which I was not afraid to die. That spirit made me a free man. In a way, the only light available to Douglass at that time was to light himself on fire. And that fire made him free. When he was assaulted one last time by Covey, he took him and threw him to the ground, despite the potential for death. But from that moment on, he found the strength to become the person we honor today, and not one of the millions of enslaved people who were lost to history. So to honor Douglass, we don't all need to be unafraid to die. But we must not always choose to rest in the sunshine of privilege. We have to accept our collective education of what 400 years of white supremacy has done and continues to do to people of color in this country who are our fellow citizens, our neighbors, and our friends. So remember the words about power. Douglass said that he resisted with force because a man without force is without the essential dignity of humanity. So while eschewing violence, we still must be forceful. We must demand forcefully that power is shared with all. Political power, economic power, social power. We have to demand for all the essential dignity of humanity. The dignity that was demanded by Douglass, and that is demanded today by marginalized groups who struggle for racial justice, require those of us who grew up expecting dignity to work hard for the dignity of others. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your